with Jennifer Dugan. Jennifer?
We're only about 100 feet away now, Hal. Wait, there's
The Avengers and a group of mercenaries in Lagos, Nigeria last.
The damage, the destruction, and we, the innocents, are left to pick up the pieces.
They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. See, I'm not a monster. I'm just ahead of the curve.
As ironic as it is, everyone loves a good villain. We love to hate them, jeer at them, despise them for the challenges and hardships that they impose on our heroes and the worlds that they inhabit. Why though? Is it because of the emotional release we experience when our heroes finally triumph over them to save the world or those they love? Or could it be that we find gratitude in the deconstruction of our society and individual psyches that the very best villains perform? In a recent study of 2,000 US adults, it was found that 51% of viewers almost always find themselves rooting for the villain, and at least 3 in 5 said that they watch a series or movie solely for the villain. Are these statistics indicative of a pervasive and deeply rooted cynicism that allows us to subconsciously align with even the most radical of ideologies? Okay, the answer probably isn't that morose, but there is without a doubt so much added entertainment value in a villain that rejects social norms in a manner that causes us to reflect on the world around us, and even for a moment to consider the subtle and underlying truth and the unrelenting cynicism of their beliefs. In the article, Villains, Victims, and Heroes in Character Theory and Affect Control Theory, the authors propose that fictional villains hold an unassailable role in society. They focus blame, provide a clear target for action and activism, intensify negative emotions toward injustice, and solidify group identities, meaning that we are better able to empathize and stand in solidarity with one another because of villains. Some would contend that the best villains tend to have clear convictions, motivations, and pathologies that fuel them, their actions generally being accompanied by a heavy social commentary that proves to foster interest and intense emotional reactions out of the audience. This is why villains like Pain from Naruto, Thanos, Magneto, and others evoke so much intrigue in the collective conscious. And in the same vein, other villains that lack the clear, complex, and sometimes valid motifs may possess the same profound impact on the audience because conviction is still there, even if it is not cultivated by an external construct or stimulus. For example, a villain like Lex Luthor differs in that he does not really have a somewhat humane end goal to his actions or intense trauma fueling his villainy. Many of his actions appeal to his own self-interest and are a result of an insatiable desire to bend the will of Superman and to critically examine the implications of his existence in a very mortal and finite world. His modus operandi is a little more chaotic and unsympathetic, evoking more of an incendiary response from the audience. Irredeemable and abhorrent actions do not necessarily have to be accompanied by a mired worldview brought about by an unstable childhood, and the rationale does not necessarily have to be rooted in an inconvenient societal truth for a character to land with the audience. This showcases the flexibility of the villain archetype and why we cling to them, and why they are often the driving force behind some of the best works of fiction ever made. But before we go any further, let's really dig deep on the characteristics that the best villains have consistently held over the years. In other words, what are the main emotions and character traits that have historically fueled amorality and human fallacy? If you open the nearest dictionary, open up your favorite search engine, it's 2023 after all, and search for the word villain, you are likely to see the following definition. In a film, novel, or play, a character whose evil actions or motives steer the plot. The most intriguing part of this definition is that their motives are important to the plot. The villain's role is to push the plot forward by challenging our hero and by extension the better part of ourselves. Our values, our beliefs are also challenged because our heroes act as a reflection of the most presentable and admirable components of human nature. Righteousness, moral certainty, honesty, compassion, strength, perseverance, and kindness are all attributes that most heroes possess in some form or another. So, what traits do villains generally possess? Like our heroes serve as personifications of our greatest attributes, our villains are reflections of the fallacy of human nature, of those suppressed inner compulsions and vices that we reject or try to reject. The vices that have historically represented evil are envy, greed, hate, vanity, and ego. These items are communicated and expressed in distinct manners depending on the motivations and life narratives of the villains. Ego is usually communicated by a grandiose sense of self and an intense desire to achieve notoriety or have their inflated sense of brilliance be recognized by all. Greed is characterized by the desire to want more, usually leading to conquest or attainment of wealth, power, or status via underhanded means, sullying the individual's moral compass and principles given that they possess them in the first place. Hate is a virulent dislike for an entity, construct, individual, or group of people. This emotion in our villains is usually unfounded and based on faulty, deep-rooted beliefs and preconceived notions. Vanity is the attachment of value in achievements and external devices and is usually accompanied by an excessive pride in those achievements. Vanity often acts as a precipitator to traits like greed, envy, and ego. Now that we have gotten these core villain traits out of the way, we can begin to really analyze why we're so captivated by them and how and why certain villain archetypes become more well received than others depending on societal contexts such as sensibilities and rapidly changing social norms. To further reiterate this point, in the book Heroes and Villains, Mike Alsford contends that what a culture considers heroic and villainous largely reflects that culture's underlying attitudes and values. This explains why certain villains become more relevant over time and why others go out of favor with time. This is crucial to consider when assessing how and why audiences are receptive to certain types of villains and archetypes of villains. I believe that there are three overarching pillars or archetypes in villain characterization. They are the classic villain, the sympathetic villain, and the embodiment of evil villain.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally? You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't see the light until I was already a man. By then it was nothing to me but blinding.
As the characters that we create in fiction are nothing more than extensions of our multi-layered consciousness and schemas of the world around us, many characters will obviously not rigidly fit in one category or the other. There will be some overlap in these archetypes. For example, the Joker's tenuous pathology, albeit one that is mostly shrouded by ambiguity in most incarnations of the character, might easily evoke sympathy for those that have been compromised and subjected to those same ills of society. Those aligning with counterculture and cynical ideologies may find his nihilistic actions to be more understandable, even reasonable, even though his actions are objectively abhorrent, chaotic, and amoral in almost every facet. However, with this overlap being acknowledged, these categories are nonetheless effective in defining and distinguishing these villain archetypes from each other. Just be sure to be aware of this caveat as we discuss each archetype and the villains that belong to them.
You could not live with your own failure. Where did that bring you? Back to me.
The classic villain, dastardly and cowardly in his acts, he holds no redeemable qualities and does not necessarily have to hold an extensive background layered with rationale or motive. Their actions are usually presented as irredeemable and wholly precipitated of their own volition. They disseminate pain to our hero and the world around them because of their propensity for amorality, usually fueled by one of or many of our aforementioned villain traits: ego, greed, vanity, envy, and hate. These core items can manifest into a myriad of schemas, motivations, and ideologies. For example, hate can be articulated through the villain via vile and indiscriminate racism. Vanity and greed can be communicated by a villain's excessive need for command and expansion. Possibly the oldest villain trope is the need for world domination. Envy is articulated by a ghastly need to get the upper hand on the individual or construct that evokes envy from said villain. The character usually acts on this envy through irredeemable actions, causing the eventual dissolution of whatever moral system that was in place. ego implores the villain to scratch that insatiable urge to validate an inflated sense of self through whatever means necessary. This ego can even cause our villains to foster positive societal development should that mean that the world acknowledges their efforts. These actions are usually achieved through malicious means as the process becomes obsolete for them when the ultimate outcome is adulation. Executed well, characters of this archetype are able to effortlessly elicit those intense emotions from the audience due to the deplorable nature of their warped worldview and actions. These villains have been relevant throughout the history of fiction and act as perfect foils to heroes possessing admirable qualities and convictions that we as an audience identify with. The Green Goblin, for example, acts as a continuous foil to Spider-Man and more profoundly Peter Parker throughout Spider-Man's lore. Oftentimes, Norman Osborn's motivations stem from greed and the desire to amplify the hold that Oscorp has on the industry of chemical manufacturing. Later on, he develops this almost pathological desire to compound additional turmoil and dysfunction in the life of Peter Parker. Not necessarily because of his upbringing, although it was obviously not idyllic, but because he sees the relationship as an embattlement that he must win, and this inspires his crusade against Peter Parker and those that he loves. The classic villain is one that is fallen out of favor to the more complex and three-dimensional characters possessing a wealth of ideology and complex and layered ideologies that fuel their actions. But villains that are vile just because serve an equally as important role. All villainous deeds do not have to be accompanied with good intentions or precipitated by the ills and isms of our world. They hold an important position in fiction and in our collective consciousness. This villain largely operates as an unstoppable force or a symbolic representation of a vice. These villains are either unconcerned with or unable to conceptualize the philosophical, moral, and religious codes of the world around them. Oftentimes, villains of this archetype may function as a malignant construct produced by some fallacy of the human condition, leaving our heroes to combat with. For example, the final villain of the acclaimed and iconic anime series Dragon Ball Z was a pink creature in which most sentences he formed were unintelligible. He acts as a force of nature that our protagonists must defeat to preserve everything that they've known and loved. Ultimately, Kid Buu is the manifestation of envy, ego, and greed that has marred humankind. Those core traits that fester and fuel the actions of most of our villains. Kid Buu is a construct that represents so many of the worst components of human nature, and this unique construction is why this offers so much value in stories. It is rarely attempted, but when done well, it can create an exhilarating and angst-filled experience for our audience because this character is not to be reasoned with. There is no underlying emotional pillars to appeal to, and this can be terrifying. However, villains in this category may also possess an unfortunate and deleterious upbringing. Their actions are so deplorable and their humanity becomes so suppressed that the fictional world and audience's sympathy is compromised. They literally become nothing more than a vehicle that projects their pathology in a destructive fashion. The Joker is an example of a character that embodies evil, even with distinct and documented histories ranging from abuse to systemic neglect and milieu. Although many still see the Joker as a sympathetic figure due to this reasoning and his propensity to muse about the ills of the world and how his nihilistic actions are necessary to help shed light on the concealed dark realities of our world. As I mentioned, these characters are bound to overlap. I mean, there's an argument that the Joker fits into all three categories, but his actions are undoubtedly a result of someone that has allowed themselves to be consumed by evil. The complexity of these characters allow them to be incredibly intriguing backdrops for the study of human nature. They are extensions of the human condition, even those that are more so forces and pure manifestations of human fallacy than grounded antagonists. The sympathetic villain has become increasingly more popular in recent years. The gravitation towards this archetype has been pervasive and rapid. Sympathetic villains offer something in motivation and backstory that encourages the audience to think, to really consider the context of amorality and not only the actions themselves. A sympathetic villain who enacts destruction on the world around him out of a viable and altruistic goal is the kind of moral dilemma that we can consume ourselves with as an audience. A villain who wants to wipe out half of the universe is unequivocally villainous, and the moral compass has long been compromised by an unbending conviction. But when the goal is to preserve the future of the universe and to decelerate the excessive command of the finite resources of a world, you at least lend an ear. Magneto's tragic intersectionality as a Jew who has been both intimately acquainted with the horrors of the Holocaust and the horrors of mutant persecution rationalizes his radicalism to an extent. His actions have largely been amoral and in direct contrast to the belief systems of Charles Xavier and the X-Men. But he is not a product of his own volition. He is a product of human fallacy, which is one of the defining traits of the sympathetic villain. This architecture has possibly never been more textbook in pain for Naruto. I mean, his entire persona, from his backstory to his goals to his literal name, is infused with ideology. Now, he threatens to rid the world not because of a singular moral feeling, but because he is willing to become an extremist if it means to eradicate the world of the pain that he had to endure. Throughout history, people have associated moral deviance with the inherent feelings of a person and not the system. Characters of this archetype, when executed well, can encourage the audience to consider the whole of a person and decide for themselves whether to assassinate the character or the conditions. And this may offer the most entertainment value for the more socially conscious sensibilities of contemporary audiences. Villains have come a long way since they were more or less two-dimensional symbols of human vice. They have expanded along with our understanding of human nature and cultural attitudes. However, no matter the architecture of a villain, at their core they act as microcosms of our worst fears and urges. They push our heroes to their breaking points while also challenging us in a similar fashion. And we cheer when they are ultimately defeated by the hero because that is representative of our own capacity to triumph over our own darkest components. And this is where hope is bred. And this is why we have been and will continue to be captivated by every face of a villain.